My name is Walter Briggs, and I am 82 years old. 5 weeks ago, my granddaughter brought her fiancé to my house for the first time, and while I was in the kitchen fetching coffee, I heard her tell him, through the doorway, in a light, dismissive tone she probably didn't think I'd overhear, that I was just a retired nobody who used to work some boring desk job, nothing worth asking too many questions about. What she didn't know, and what her fiancé certainly had no way of knowing, was that when his own father arrived 20 minutes later to pick him up, he took one look at me standing in my living room, went completely still, and then snapped to attention and saluted me before he'd said a single word to his own son. If you've ever been quietly written off by someone who never thought to ask what you'd actually done with your life, stay with me until the end. This story isn't about proving my granddaughter wrong for a careless comment. It's about the strange, particular way an entire life of quiet service can announce itself in a single unexpected moment, decades after you'd stopped expecting anyone to notice. Welcome to Silent Honor USA, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most. If this story moves you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly how this evening actually unfolded. I need to tell you who I was before that living room, because otherwise a stranger's salute won't carry the weight it's actually supposed to carry. I enlisted in the Army in 1961, 17 years old with my mother's signature required to let me in early, out of a small town outside of Erie, Pennsylvania, and I served 28 years altogether, including 2 tours in Vietnam between 1965 and 1968. I want to tell you specifically about the shape of my career, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that happened decades later, and because the specific nature of what I actually did for the majority of those 28 years is something I've discussed with almost no one outside a small, shrinking circle of former colleagues. Following my second tour, I was selected, somewhat to my own surprise at the time, for a specialized assignment within Army counterintelligence, work that occupied the remaining 2 decades of my career, and that I still, even now, can only describe to my own family in the broadest, most careful terms, given the specific nature of classified work and the standards of discretion that remain expected of those of us who performed it, regardless of how many decades have passed. I can tell you, in general terms, that this work involved identifying and countering espionage threats against American military personnel and operations, work that required extensive travel, extended periods where I couldn't tell my own wife where I actually was, and a specific kind of vigilance that never fully turns off, even decades into retirement. I want to describe, as best I can within the bounds of what I'm still able to share, the specific texture of that career. There were stretches, sometimes lasting several months, where I operated under an assumed professional identity, developing relationships with individuals I couldn't discuss, gathering information through channels I still can't fully detail, work that demanded a particular kind of internal discipline, the ability to compartmentalize entire portions of my own life so completely that even I, at times, had to consciously remind myself which version of my own history I was permitted to discuss with which people. I attended training that most soldiers never encounter, developed skills in observation, deception detection, and secure communication that became, over the decades, so deeply ingrained that Eleanor used to joke, gently, that I read a room the way other men read a newspaper. I remember specific operations, details I still can't share even now, that resulted in the identification of individuals attempting to compromise American military personnel or operations, work that, had it gone differently, could have cost lives on a scale most people never think about when they imagine what intelligence work actually looks like. I remember the particular weight of those years, the knowledge that a single mistake on my part, a single piece of information handled incorrectly, could unravel months or years of careful work and put people I'd never even meet directly in genuine danger. I want to be honest about the actual weight of that work, because I think it's easy for people to assume a career spent behind a desk, doing work that can't even be discussed, is somehow less consequential than more visible, more dramatic service. In some ways, that's true. There were no medals I could display, no dramatic stories I could tell at dinner parties, Nothing that translated easily into the kind of narrative most people expect when they think about what a career soldier actually does. But the specific decisions I made across those 2 decades, the specific threats I helped identify and neutralize before they could cost American lives, carried consequences every bit as real as anything decided under direct fire, consequences I simply couldn't discuss with anyone who hadn't earned the specific clearance required to hear them. I retired in 1989 as a full colonel, and I want to be clear that this particular career, unlike something more visibly heroic, produced almost no public recognition, simply the quiet, largely invisible knowledge that I'd spent 20 years trying to protect soldiers and operations from threats most of them never knew existed in the first place. I remember my retirement ceremony, a fairly modest affair given the nature of my work, attended by a small handful of colleagues who understood, in the general way clearance allowed, what I'd actually contributed. Men and women who shook my hand with a particular knowing weight that Eleanor, standing beside me, could sense but never fully access herself. I met my wife Eleanor in 1963, shortly before my first deployment, and we married in 1964. Eleanor was a librarian, patient, and remarkably steady in ways that complemented my own guarded temperament, and she carried, throughout our 56 years of marriage until her passing 4 years ago, a genuine understanding that most of what I'd actually done during those 2 decades of counterintelligence work simply couldn't be discussed, not out of any lack of trust, but out of genuine legal and professional necessity. I want to be honest that this particular kind of marriage, built around such extensive permanent silence, required a specific kind of faith from Eleanor that I've never fully found adequate words to thank her for. A faith that I was who I said I was, doing what needed doing, even when I couldn't tell her the specifics. I remember, specifically, a period in 1979 when I was gone for nearly 5 months without any real ability to communicate, and Eleanor later told me, years afterward, that she'd spent those months simply choosing, every single day, to trust me. Without any evidence beyond the trust itself, a choice I don't think I fully appreciated the weight of until much later in our marriage, once I finally had the perspective to look back clearly at everything she'd carried on her own. We had one daughter, Linda, born in 1966, and I want to be honest that raising her, particularly given the extended periods of unexplained absence that counterintelligence work required, created its own particular distance, one that softened over the decades, but never entirely resolved into the kind of open, easy relationship some fathers manage with their children. I remember Linda, as a teenager, asking me directly what I actually did for the Army, and I remember giving her an answer so vague and unsatisfying, something about administrative and security work, that she eventually stopped asking, the way children do when they sense a subject their parent isn't willing or able to discuss further. Linda grew up with almost no real understanding of what I'd actually done, knowing only the vaguest outline: military service, some kind of intelligence-related work, a father who traveled frequently and explained very little, an understandable gap given how genuinely little I was permitted to fill it with, even if I'd wanted to. Linda married her husband Robert in 1990, and they had one daughter together, my granddaughter Emma, now 28 years old, a warm, capable young woman I love deeply, who works as a marketing manager and who has grown up, understandably, with almost no context for what her grandfather's career actually involved, given how little even her own mother knew to pass along. Emma spent her childhood visiting me on weekends and holidays, a warm, affectionate relationship built around ordinary grandfather activities, teaching her to fish, helping with school projects, attending her school plays, none of which ever required or invited any discussion of the specific decades I'd spent in work she had no framework for even beginning to understand. I want to be fair to Emma here, because it would be easy to paint her simply as dismissive, and that isn't the complete picture of who she actually is. She's a genuinely kind, thoughtful young woman, someone who calls me regularly, who has always shown me general affection and respect. What she's never had, through absolutely no fault of her own, is any real material to understand my career as anything more than a vague, unremarkable biographical detail. A grandfather who worked for the Army, in some capacity nobody in the family ever fully understood or discussed. A gap in understanding that had simply been allowed to persist, unquestioned and uncorrected, across the entire span of her 28 years, largely because neither Linda nor I had ever given her much reason to question it. 5 weeks ago, Emma brought her fiancé, a young man named Christopher, to my house for the first time. An important visit, the kind of meeting that carries real weight for a young couple planning a future together. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, cleaning the house more thoroughly than usual, picking up a few things from the store I thought a young man might appreciate, the particular nervous anticipation of a grandfather meeting the person his granddaughter intends to spend her life with. Christopher seemed genuinely likable from the moment he arrived, polite, a little nervous in the specific way young men often are meeting a grandfather for the first time, asking thoughtful questions about my house, about the garden I still maintain despite my age, about a set of old photographs on my mantle that he seemed genuinely curious about rather than simply making polite conversation. I found myself warming to him considerably over the first half hour of their visit, watching the easy, affectionate way he and Emma interacted, the specific quality of a relationship built on genuine partnership rather than mere convenience. I excused myself to the kitchen partway through their visit to fetch coffee, a small errand that would normally have taken no more than a minute or two, and it was there, through the open doorway between my kitchen and living room, that I overheard Emma speaking to Christopher in a lowered but still audible voice, the particular register people use when they think they're being discreet, but haven't quite accounted for how sound carries through an open doorway. "Grandpa's just a retired nobody," she said, with a light, dismissive laugh that carried no apparent malice, the kind of offhand comment you make when you're trying to put someone at ease before a slightly nerve-wracking meeting. "He worked some boring desk job in the army for like 30 years. Nothing exciting, so don't feel like you need to ask him a bunch of questions about it. He doesn't really talk about it much anyway, so just ask him about his garden or something if you need small talk material." I stood there in my own kitchen, 82 years old, coffee pot in hand, absorbing the particular sting of hearing my entire career, decades of work I genuinely couldn't discuss even if I'd wanted to, casually characterized as boring and unremarkable, spoken to the young man my granddaughter intended to marry, a young man whose entire first impression of who I actually was had just been shaped, in that exact moment, by an assumption built on nothing more than my own necessary silence. I remember standing there a moment longer than necessary, the coffee pot suspended in my hand, absorbing the strange, quiet weight of hearing yourself described so completely and so casually incorrectly by someone who loves you. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't primarily anger. Men who spent careers in classified work develop a particular capacity to absorb this kind of casual dismissal without much visible reaction, precisely because we've spent decades accepting that most people will never understand what we actually did, by design rather than by accident. What I felt was something quieter, a tired, familiar recognition of exactly how completely my own necessary discretion had shaped my own granddaughter's understanding of who I actually was. A recognition that carried, underneath it, a genuine sadness that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with distance. I carried the coffee back out to the living room without saying anything, made mild conversation for the remainder of their visit, asking Christopher about his own work in structural engineering, listening to Emma describe wedding planning details with genuine warmth, and gave no indication that I'd overheard anything at all. What happened next, I want to be absolutely clear, was not something I orchestrated in any way. I had no advanced knowledge whatsoever that it was coming, and the specific mechanics of how it unfolded matter considerably to understanding why it carried the weight it eventually did. About 20 minutes later, Christopher's father, a man named General Frank Delgado, arrived to pick up his son, having offered to drive him home, since Emma needed to head to a separate appointment across town. I hadn't met Christopher's father before, and I had no particular expectation about the visit beyond a brief, polite introduction, the kind of short, cordial exchange that typically happens when a young man's parent stops by to collect him from a family visit. Emma answered the door, and General Delgado stepped into my living room, still dressed in his service uniform, having apparently come directly from an official function across the base, his presence immediately changing the specific texture of the room in the way a uniform sometimes does among people unaccustomed to it. I want to describe what happened next exactly as it occurred, because I've told this part of the story to enough people since that evening to know it sounds almost too dramatic to be true, and yet it happened precisely this way. General Delgado's eyes moved across the room, taking in the space in the quick, assessing way career officers often do, cataloging details almost automatically, and then stopped, fixed directly on me, standing near my armchair where I'd risen to greet him. His expression shifted, something between recognition and disbelief, a specific flicker I've seen before in the rare instances someone has recognized me from that earlier chapter of my life, and he came immediately to attention, snapping into a full, formal salute before he'd said a single word to his own son, or to Emma, holding it with the precise, practiced stillness of a man who understood exactly the weight of the gesture he was making. "Colonel Briggs," he said, his voice carrying the specific formal clarity of a parade ground address rather than a casual greeting. "Sir, it's an honor. I had no idea you'd be here. I served under Colonel Hastings in 1987, and your name came up more times than I could count during my own early training. I never thought I'd actually meet you in person." The room went completely silent. Christopher stared at his father with visible confusion, glancing between him and me as though trying to reconcile two entirely different pictures of the same afternoon. Emma, standing near the door where she'd just let General Delgado in, went pale, her earlier dismissive comment clearly replaying itself in her mind in real time, her hand still resting on the doorknob, as though she'd forgotten to close it. "Dad," Christopher said slowly, "you're saluting Emma's grandfather. Why are you saluting Emma's grandfather?" General Delgado spent the next several minutes explaining, with obvious genuine respect, that he'd served early in his career under an officer who had frequently referenced my work in counterintelligence, describing, in the careful, general terms that classified work still requires even decades later, the specific reputation I'd carried among a certain generation of officers, a reputation built on work most of them understood only in outline, but respected enormously nonetheless. He mentioned, specifically, a training seminar early in his career where an instructor had cited, without naming me directly at the time for security reasons, a particular counterintelligence operation credited with identifying a significant threat before it could compromise an entire unit. An operation he'd only learned years later, through informal channels among senior officers, had been personally led by a colonel named Walter Briggs. "I want you to understand something," General Delgado said, turning briefly to address Emma and Christopher directly. "The people who trained me, and the people who trained them, spoke of your grandfather's work with a level of respect I've rarely encountered for anyone in that field. What he did, most of us will never fully know the details of, but we know it mattered enormously." Emma sat down slowly on the edge of the couch, visibly shaken, her hands trembling slightly as she processed what she was hearing. "Grandpa," she said quietly, "I told Christopher you were just a retired nobody. I said it right before you walked in with the coffee. I think you probably heard me." "I did hear you," I said gently. "I'm not upset with you, Emma. You said what you understood to be true, based on what I'd actually given you to understand, which wasn't much of anything at all. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Emma asked. "Any of this?" "Because most of it, I genuinely couldn't tell you," I said. "Classified work doesn't simply expire because decades have passed, Emma. But I think if I'm honest with myself, even the parts I could have shared in general terms, I simply never volunteered, because staying quiet had become such a deep habit that I stopped noticing it needed correcting." Christopher, still visibly processing the entire scene, looked between his father and me with something like genuine awe. "I had no idea any of this was even possible," he said. "I mean, I knew you were in the Army, obviously, but I thought Emma meant like, actually a desk job, filing paperwork or something." "For 20 years, I said. That's precisely what I let everyone believe, in one form or another. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It simply wasn't the whole truth, and I chose, deliberately, never to correct the gap." General Delgado stayed considerably longer than he'd originally planned, and I want to describe the specific texture of the following hour. The four of us sitting in my living room while he asked his own careful, respectful questions. Questions I answered in the general terms my clearance still permits. Watching Emma listen with an expression of genuine, humbled attention I hadn't seen from her before. He mentioned at one point that he'd like to arrange, if I were willing, an opportunity for me to speak informally with some of the younger intelligence officers currently training at his installation. An invitation that genuinely moved me, given how rarely, across the preceding 30 years of retirement, anyone had thought to ask. We talked for nearly 2 hours that evening. Once General Delgado and Christopher had finally departed with real warmth and a promise to return soon, a conversation considerably more honest than anything Emma and I had managed across her entire adult life. I told her, in as much detail as I'm still permitted to share, about the general shape of counterintelligence work, about the specific toll it took on Eleanor and on my relationship with Linda, about what it had actually meant to carry decades of necessary silence inside a family that deserved, in some ways, considerably more than I'd ever given them. I told her about the specific stretch in 1979 when I'd been gone nearly 5 months, about Eleanor's quiet, daily choice to trust me without evidence, a story Emma had never once heard, despite having heard, in vague outline, that her grandmother had been very patient with my career. I think I always just assumed patient meant boring, Emma said, quietly, toward the end of that long conversation. I never once considered it might have meant something considerably harder than that. In the 5 weeks since that evening, something has genuinely shifted in how Emma relates to me. She calls more often, asking real questions, wanting to understand whatever general shape of my career I'm able to share with her, careful and respectful of the boundaries I've explained still genuinely exist around certain details even now. She's told Christopher, according to him, that she's genuinely ashamed of what she said that day, and Christopher himself has become, in his own way, considerably more curious about my history than most young men meeting a girlfriend's grandfather typically are, asking, during a recent visit, whether he might be permitted to hear more about the general nature of the work whenever I felt comfortable sharing it. Linda, too, has approached me differently since hearing the full story from Emma, calling to ask her own questions for the first time in years. Questions about her own childhood, about the specific months I'd been away that she remembered only as vague, unexplained absences. Conversations that have, in their own way, begun closing a distance between us that had persisted for nearly 6 decades. I don't tell you this story because I want credit for classified work I still can't fully discuss, or because I need a stranger's salute to validate a career I already knew mattered. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The quiet, necessary silence many of us carried across our careers often left the people closest to us with almost nothing to understand who we actually were, not through any failure of love, but through the simple, unavoidable weight of what discretion sometimes requires. That doesn't mean our worth depends on some unexpected moment eventually revealing the truth. It means dignity was already there, quietly, whether or not anyone ever happened to see it clearly. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life whose actual history you might not fully understand, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe, because we have a new story like this one every week.